In other countries that have experienced this kind of democratic backsliding or full-on transition to authoritarianism, have we similarly seen a rollback of the safety net, maybe to spend more money on propaganda like military parades?
Honestly, the speed at which this is happening and the kind of concentrated push to do this, it doesn't have any parallel in situations where leaders came to power through elections. If you look at the early Putin or the early Orban or Erdoğan, they didn't move at this speed. This resembles more after there's been a coup.
You just heard from Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor of history at New York University, who explained how in other authoritarian regimes where dictators were democratically elected, none of them moved towards authoritarianism as quickly as Donald Trump has. And just for comparison's sake, Vladimir Putin was first elected to Russia back in 2000, then re-elected in 2004, but by 2008 he was term limited up. So, to subvert constitutional term limits, he let his second-in-command, Dmitry Medvedev, become the president while he stepped back to serve as prime minister. Now, even though Putin was the one pulling all of the strings, he wasn't entirely ready to give up the facade of democracy at that point, which is why he pretended to respect constitutional term limits. But when he returned in 2012, that's when all bets were off, and in this timeline from AP, they explained that that's when he changed the constitution to expand presidential term limits and really began to crack down on dissent. And by the time he came back to power in 2012, he never gave up power, but by the time he came back to power, the Duma, which is Russia's legislature, was already rubber stamping everything that he wanted. Now, when it comes to Turkey, Tayyip Erdoğan was first elected back in 2003, and even though Turkey had a secular constitution modeled after the French laïcité model, Erdoğan used religious fundamentalism to rise to power in the same way that George W. Bush did in 2000 and 2004, and it didn't take long for Erdoğan to undermine democratic norms in the same way that Donald Trump did during his first term, but it wasn't until 2016 that he really started to crack down on journalists and shut down oppositional media outlets, as explained in this short documentary by the Wall Street Journal. But Turkey's parliamentary democracy didn't officially die until 2017, which is when a referendum passed that expanded presidential term limits and gave Erdoğan control over the judiciary and let him rule by decree, basically. As for Viktor Orban, he wasn't elected in Hungary until 2010, but has already made almost as much progress as them at dismantling democracy. But with that being said, it's still been a really gradual process. He's currently in his fourth term, and he's dismantled democratic checks and balances and honed in on the media and universities in particular, and people in Trump's administration are watching and learning from him. Like Trump, he's stacked the judiciary with loyalists, and like Erdoğan, and to a lesser extent Donald Trump, he's also cracked down on oppositional media outlets to consolidate power. Although, to Professor Ben-Ghiat's point, Trump has gone way further in 2 months than Orban has gone in 15 years. And Orban also galvanized the public, by the way, by targeting LGBTQ plus people. In fact, Florida's Don't Say Gay law was modeled after Hungary's anti-LGBT propaganda policy. Now, even though there's differences between Russia, Turkey, and Hungary, obviously, it took all of their dictators more than a decade to consolidate power to the point where they became dictators, where checks and balances were gone, and the judiciary was meaningless, and the media and universities, as well as civil society, basically all fell to state control. In other words, it takes a long time to turn democracies into dictatorships, if democracy is the starting place. The reason why it's usually incremental is because when you introduce so many changes at once, that can become destabilizing, which is counterproductive since it can lead to protests and societal opposition that threatens the legitimacy of the new regime that you're trying to cultivate. So that's why Professor Ben-Ghiat said the amount of change that we're currently seeing only usually happens where there's been a coup, because that in and of itself is a significant change. So it makes sense to kind of rip the Band-Aid off so people aren't left wondering what comes next. Since, again, stability is necessary to maintain control. But in Trump's America, he's governing as if he just pulled off a coup. And that's because the architects of Project 2025, they actually do view what's happening now as a revolution. And just to remind you, here's what Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, said in July of last year.
The reason that they are apoplectic right now, the reason that so many anchors on MSNBC, for example, are losing their minds daily is because our side is winning. And so I come full circle in this response and just want to encourage you with some substance that we are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
He says revolution, I say coup. I mean, sure, Trump was democratically elected, as was the case with Putin in Russia, Erdoğan in Turkey, and Orban in Hungary. But as those dictators have taught us, that doesn't necessarily mean that democratically elected leaders can't become dictators and can't hijack democratic institutions in a coup-like way. I mean, a slow-moving coup is still a coup. Now, on the subject of Project 2025, which is a 180-day project, by the way, it's already 42% complete and is nearly on track to be fully implemented by the end of Trump's first 6 months in office. And I'd imagine that the progress of Project 2025 is one of the many reasons why political scientists like Stephen Levinsky have already concluded that America is no longer a democracy because it fails to meet the criteria of liberal democracies. And part of the problem is that Trump isn't slowing down. In response to some Democrats wanting to impeach him, he called on Republicans to consider expelling them from Congress. They're already arresting judges and threatening to arrest sitting members of Congress like AOC and even governors who won't comply with their Gestapo-like immigration force. And a crackdown on political opponents is the hallmark of all dictatorships. Not to mention, the Justice Department is literally rolling back school desegregation policies from the civil rights era. And when you consider the attack on civil rights for LGBTQ plus people and the potential passage of the SAVE Act, which could disenfranchise millions of married women, as well as the rollback of women's reproductive rights, I mean, you can see how the vision laid out in Project 2025 is already starting to take shape. And one thing that really sets Trump apart from Putin, Erdoğan, and Orban is that they were all very hesitant about brazenly disregarding their constitution, whereas Trump couldn't care less. He's doing it out in the open, and he's doing all of these authoritarian things immediately. He's not even dipping his toes in, like he's diving in head first. See, other dictators are at least smart enough to pretend to respect the Constitution. And if they want to violate the Constitution, they amend it so it reflects what they want or what they're going to do, because they know that explicitly violating the Constitution isn't the best way to legitimize yourself and demonstrate that you're committed to law and order, which is something that dictators often like to do. But Trump doesn't even bother to pretend. Case in point.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Well, the Fifth Amendment says
I don't know.
as
It seems it might say that, but if you're talking about that, then we'd have to have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million trials. We have thousands of people that are some murderers and some drug dealers and some of the worst people on earth.
But
some of the worst, most dangerous people on earth. And I was elected to get them the hell out of here, and the courts are holding me from doing it.
But even given those numbers that you're talking about, don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know. I have to respond by saying again, I have brilliant lawyers that work for me, and they are going to obviously follow what the Supreme Court said. What you said is not what I heard the Supreme Court said. They have a different interpretation.
He doesn't know if people deserve a constitutionally protected right and doesn't even know if he's obligated to uphold the Constitution as president. It is astounding to me that he is saying this on national television. Imagine being that fucking stupid. But I mean, that blatant disregard right there for the Constitution and the rule of law might actually be our saving grace, ironically, because Americans all saw him take the oath of office and swore to uphold the Constitution. So if he is already publicly, flippantly disregarding it, that right there is how regimes fall, especially in these early stages of power consolidation. And think about why other democratically elected dictators, like Putin, for example, are so hesitant to give people the appearance that they don't care about the Constitution. Like, we know that they don't care, but Putin, if he's going to stay in office past his constitutionally allowed term limit, why go through the process of amending the Constitution when you're just going to do what you want anyway? What is the point of the dog and pony show? Well, legitimacy. That is a key term in political science that you have to familiarize yourself with. Legitimacy leads to stability and regime longevity, because stability afforded to citizens from a legitimate state that upholds the rule of law makes them more likely to be complacent and basically go along with whatever the dictator wants. Legitimacy is necessary as a currency for all governments, and that includes dictatorships as well, who are trying to tighten their grip on power. You can't just ignore legitimacy. You have to constantly cultivate legitimacy for the state if you want to survive. So if citizens can detect that a president is a tyrant and they start mobilizing as a result of said tyranny, sure, the president can use the military to crack down on them, but ruling with an iron fist isn't as easy as ruling over a docile population that's more willing to overlook incremental moves towards authoritarianism. It's like the frog in the boiling pot analogy, right? If you throw a frog in a boiling pot of water, it's going to jump out. But if you throw a frog in a pot of water and you gradually turn up the heat, it's going to be able to adapt to the temperature change. Sure, you can try to stop the frog from jumping out of a boiling pot, but if you try to cover it, odds are you could end up getting burned yourself. This is why authoritarian creep is typically more insidious in formerly democratic regimes where dictators were elected, because conditioning a society to reject democracy is a lengthy process if you're coming from a democracy. But Trump is too stupid to understand that, and he keeps doing things to undermine his own legitimacy and state legitimacy, which is intertwined with his own legitimacy as well. I mean, he is disregarding a 9-0 Supreme Court decision to facilitate the return of Abrigo Garcia, and as time goes on, we learn more and more about how many innocent people are getting caught up in his deportation regime. A new report from the Washington Post found that Trump sent Venezuelan immigrants to CICOT, even though Venezuela agreed to take them. Additionally, 2 of the men were vetted refugees legally allowed to stay. 4 of them had protections from removal since they were fleeing humanitarian crises, and others had open asylum claims that hadn't been adjudicated. And 2 analyses concluded that most of the men sent to the CICOT concentration camp in the first round of deportations were innocent. One report said 75%, the other said 90%. Which lines up with the anecdotal evidence that we're seeing of a gay makeup artist or somebody who had a tattoo of autism awareness for his brother, but that was taken as a gang tattoo, and, asylum seekers being kidnapped and sent to CICOT. So due process is just not being respected, and people see that. On top of that, students like Rumeysa Öztürk, as well as permanent residents like Mahmoud Khalil and Mousa Madawi, who was recently released, thankfully, they're being detained for exercising their First Amendment rights, and Trump is also violating the First Amendment with his numerous religious pro-Christian executive orders, and even said that he doesn't know if the separation of church and state exists, but he thinks that we should forget about that for one time. So I say all this to say that he's moving us towards authoritarianism so fast that it is having a destabilizing effect on society. And maybe Americans would give him a pass if things were going better for them, but that's not the case. Our economic condition is also rapidly deteriorating due to deliberate decisions that this dumbass president has made, and his only defense is to blame Biden.
When does it become the Trump economy?
It partially is right now. I think the good parts are the Trump economy and the bad parts are the Biden economy.
Makes total sense. Of course, he deserves all of the credit and none of the blame. Sounds fair to me. Now, on the subject of the economy, he responded to a question about potential shortages and the cost of goods rising. And I've got to say, this response to me was incredible. Just watch.
You said, quote, I'm going to quote what you said, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30.
Yeah.
And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally. Are you saying that your tariffs will cause some prices to go up?
No, I think the tariffs are going to be great for us because it's going to make us rich.
But you said some dolls are going to cost more. Isn't that an acknowledgement that some prices will go up?
I don't think a beautiful baby girl that's 11 years old needs to have 30 dolls. I think they can have 3 dolls or 4 dolls because what we were doing with China was just unbelievable. We had a trade deficit of hundreds of billions of dollars with China.
When you say they could have $3 instead of $30, are you saying Americans could see empty store shelves?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying they don't need to have $30. They can have 3. They don't need to have 250 pencils. They can have 5.
I am begging any reporter, to ask him how much he thinks a banana costs.
I mean, it's 1 banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
That's Trump. He cannot fathom how painfully out of touch he is. The kids these days, they're collecting pencils like fucking Pokemon cards. Amazing. A man who literally shits in a gold toilet is telling everybody else to start tightening their belts. He can have dozens of properties, but your daughters can only have $2. That's his limit. Deal with it. I mean, we live in a capitalist culture that subsists on nonstop consumption and overconsumption. So him telling Americans to limit their consumption is not going to bode well for him. But I mean, this is what I mean. It's not just the pace and brazenness of his authoritarianism. It is the deteriorating material conditions that make the situation untenable for him. He doesn't understand that no regime can survive without legitimacy. So ironically, his attempt to rapidly consolidate power, in addition to his harmful economic policies, might be what undermines his dictatorial ambitions in the end. And if things continue to get worse and go on this path, Americans could become so desperate that they take to the streets. And when that happens, one of two things will happen. His government will either collapse or he'll double down on the authoritarianism and try to use the military to crush those protests. Now, it seems like he's going to opt for the latter option, as evidenced by the executive orders that he signed last week that militarize police forces. Although I will say, in that same interview, he's now, walking back some authoritarian tendencies. For example, he said that he doesn't plan to run for a third term.
The Trump organization is selling hats that say Trump 2028.
Yeah.
Are you seriously considering a third term, Mr. President, even though it's prohibited by the Constitution? Or is this about staying politically viable?
I will say this. So many people want me to do it. I have never had requests so strong as that. But it's something that, to the best of my knowledge, you're not allowed to do. I don't know if that's constitutional that they're not allowing you to do it or anything else, but there are many people selling the 2028 hat. But this is not something I'm looking to do. I'm looking to have 4 great years and turn it over to somebody, ideally a great Republican, to carry it forward. But I think we're going to have 4 years, and I think 4 years is plenty of time to do something really spectacular.
The Constitution does prohibit it. Some of your allies are pretty serious about this, though, Mr. President. I've spoken to them. They say they are coming up with potential ways.
Well,
obviously, the biggest one will be a constitutional amendment.
That's because they like the job I'm doing, and it's a compliment.
Has anyone in an official capacity presented you with, sir, here are some ideas by which you could actually get a constitutional amendment?
Well, in a capacity of being a big supporter, many people have said different things, but I'm not looking at that.
I mean, we'll see, because Trump is liable to change his mind, as we've all learned. I could see him in a couple of years saying, well, I have no choice. I've got to run again because I'm doing such a great job and people want me to, and I have to finish the job that I started. And right there, even though he's saying he doesn't want to seek a third term, he's still pretending to not know about the 22nd Amendment, which doesn't necessarily give me the confidence that he is going to respect the Constitution and step down after 2 terms. So we'll see. But I mean, the fact that he very clearly doesn't care about the Constitution and doesn't even care about the appearance that he respects the Constitution shows you how stupid he is. Other dictators would not do that. They would say, no, I respect the Constitution, and then they would try to amend the Constitution so that way it doesn't seem as if they are brazenly violating the law, but Trump just doesn't care because he lacks the self-awareness that even other dictators have. But I mean, the true test as to whether or not we become a full-blown dictatorship, if we're not already in that territory, is if Republicans can ram through the electoral reform that they've been trying to get through to suppress more votes. I mean, they passed the SAVE Act in the House, which could disenfranchise millions of married women and LGBTQ plus people, namely trans people. Also, Trump signed an executive order recently to centralize power of elections by giving DOJ authority over state and local government. So that way, if there's fraud, they can do an audit and make changes based on their audit. We'll see if that holds up in court, but these changes will determine whether or not we have free and fair elections going forward. So that's something to keep in mind. But one thing that I will say that gives me a little bit of hope is that even if Trump is ignoring the courts haven't completely bent the knee to him, even though he's stacked the judiciary with his loyalists. So, that independence right there is really important. He might be moving faster than other dictators have in the past, but he hasn't been successful at stripping away the independence of the judiciary as well as the media. So that's important. The fact that he wants to do that in and of itself is troubling, obviously, but whether or not the dictatorial changes he's making sticks is something that's yet to be determined. But to go back to Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat's warning, I don't think anything she's saying is particularly surprising, but the fact that Trump is being so ham-fisted in his attempt to turn us into a dictatorship might ultimately be what undermines his dictatorial ambitions. But with that being said, we're in uncharted territory nonetheless, so whether or not he succeeds in the long term at making us a dictatorship is yet to be determined.
Do yourself a favor and click the join button on YouTube to become a member. Because Mike's doing a great job getting to watch his videos before everyone else is tremendous. Many people are saying this. Join today, folks. You won't regret it.